Hi everyone. So today we are going to talk about something called the money market. And this is another piece of information that you need to understand in order to understand how the Federal Reserve manages money supply and monetary policy. So we've referenced several times that the Federal Reserve may choose to increase the money supply or decrease the money supply. But what we haven't fully showed you yet is what happens when that occurs. So first we need to understand the supply and demand for money. So let's start with the demand for money. At any given time, people demand a certain amount of liquid assets or just cash money for everyday purchases. And the demand for money is just like a normal demand curve. It shows an inverse relationship, meaning a downward sloping curve. But this time it's between nominal interest rates and quantity, or quantity of money demanded. Nominal interest rates, as you know, just means the interest rate that you see out there in the economy today. So what happens to the quantity demanded of money when interest rates increase? Well, quantity demanded falls, as you would expect, but why? Well, you think about it logically. If interest rates are really high, think about your savings account. If you were getting 10% interest in your savings account, you would want to have every dollar in your savings account as often as possible and carry very little cash because it's really earning a good return. Whereas, what would happen to quantity demanded for cash when interest rates decrease? Well, the quantity demanded, meaning the amount that you would be willing to just carry around in cash or having a checking account earning no interest, would be very high if your savings account had a close to 0% interest rate, which is sort of what's happening now. So let's look at what it looks like in a visual term so that we can make the point a little bit more clearly. So it looks like a normal demand curve. You can see the quantity of money is on the x-axis and nominal interest rate is on the y-axis. And you can imagine that if there was a 20% interest rate, people would have very low quantity demanded for cash, meaning they would want that money earning as much money as possible in interest earning assets, like a savings account. Whereas if interest rates are close to zero, there's no incentive to keep your money in the bank. You might as well just have it in your pocket or under your bed, right? So what happens if price level increases? Well, what we're talking about there is inflation, and if prices are higher, you need to have more cash on hand to make the everyday purchases that you need. So demand is going to increase, right? So here are some money demand shifters. Changes in price level, changes in income. If people's incomes are going up, they're going to have a higher demand for money. Or changes in taxation that affect investment. But the truth is, we're not going to focus too much on the demand for money. We're really going to be focusing on the supply of money since we're talking about the Federal Reserve. We know by now that the U.S. money supply is set by the Federal Reserve System, and it is a vertical line because it is set, right? And it is set by the Federal Reserve, and that's the supply of money, right? At any one moment in time, it is completely set and not changing. The Fed, we know now the Fed is a nonpartisan government office that sets and adjusts the money supply to adjust the economy. And we know that that's called monetary policy. So let's look at what happens when the Fed chooses to increase the money supply. So if the Fed increases the money supply, look at what happens in the money market. Interest rates decrease, in this case from 5% to 2%. If the Fed increases the money supply, there will be a temporary surplus of money that will occur at 5% interest. And that will push the interest rate to fall to 2%. Okay? So, and how does this affect aggregate demand? So if you look at the bottom here, you can see that an increase in the money supply decreases the interest rates that you see out there in the economy. And that then provides an incentive for businesses to begin taking loans and increasing investment. That investment, as you know, C plus I plus G plus NX, is part of aggregate demand and thus increases aggregate demand. Well, what happens if there's a decrease in the money supply? So you can see here that the money supply is decreased by the Federal Reserve, and interest rates are jumped to 10%. So why is that? Well, if the Fed decreases the money supply, there will be a temporary shortage of money at 5% interest. Well, what does that actually mean? It means that when they decrease the money supply, there will be a lot of people. There will be not a lot of people asking for money at 5%, which will encourage banks and other lenders to increase their interest rate to 10%, right? The shortage will cause the interest rate to rise to 10%, okay? Now, how will this affect aggregate demand? A decrease in the money supply will lead to an increase in the interest rates, a decrease in investment, right? Because the higher the interest rate, the less likely that businesses and consumers are going to take loans, and that decrease in investment is going to lower aggregate demand, right? So we can show this on 3 different graphs, and I have a video later that takes us through a recession and a period of inflation to sort of show this even further. But these are the graphs that are sort of linked together that cause the change. So let's say that the Fed increases the money supply to stimulate the economy. So assume that we are in a recession. Well, the interest rates will decrease, okay? Shown right here on graph number 1, supply and demand of money. That will cause the quantity of investment demand to increase, right? So there is an investment demand curve, and at 2% it's much higher, so you can see that. It's a movement along the curve, more investment, and eventually an increase in aggregate demand, helping to bring an economy out of the recession. This will increase GDP, and it will also increase the price level. Let's look at a situation where the Fed is decreasing the money supply in order to slow down the economy. It is overinflated. It is moving too fast. We have a decrease in the money supply, which raises the interest rates. Businesses look out there in the economy and see higher interest rates, and they lower their investment, right? Their quantity of investment goes down. They're not taking as many loans. And eventually aggregate demand shrinks, lowering GDP and the price level. And there you go. So in this little cartoon, you can see that this cartoon is trying to handle a period of inflation, and interest rates are being increased so that that person will stop taking loans and inflation will get under control.